My name is Stephen Miller, and I'm the Communications Manager at Waubonsee Community College. We launched this podcast so that people can learn more about the experiences and expertise of the employees, students, and partners of Waubonsee. We want you to hear firsthand from these people and learn from their experience and expertise. John Nichols is an instructor of English. He and I sat down and talked about what it means for something to be based on a true story. This tied to a discussion about conspiracy theories, which led us to talk about things like the impact of social media on the spreading and sharing of information and the debunking of false information. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And today we're talking to John Nichols, instructor of English here at Waubonsee Community College. And so we're going to have an interesting conversation, I think, about a variety of topics. John, just start off with a couple of questions. Introduce yourself. Tell us how long you've been at Waubonsee and maybe what you did before coming here.
Sure. I am in my second full year at Waubonsee in teaching as English faculty. Before that, I adjuncted here for 1 year, and then before that, several years at St. Joseph's College in Rensselaer, Indiana, where I taught English and in the humanities there. That college closed, actually, in May of 2017, and thankfully I found myself here.
There you go. So are you from this? Would you have connections here before you came?
I'd been living here, for a while. It was actually set up where I would commute down there during the week and work and come back and be with my wife and family on the weekends. So.
Awesome. All right, good. So I think today we're going to talk about a couple of things that I find interesting. The idea of the statement based on a true story,
yes.
Kind of what that means, and then conspiracy theories and what they are and how they gain traction. So tell us where did your interest in these topics begin, and what is your experience in looking at them?
Sure. The nonfiction end of things actually started for me in my first time around in grad school at DePaul University, where I was introduced to the idea of literary nonfiction, meaning I'd never really heard of it before. And it was this idea of taking the tools that a fiction writer uses and applying them to the telling of real stories. And one of the quick sort of fast ways I have of explaining just what that means is take a big event like, say, 9/11, and I could tell you when the first planes hit in New York, when the plane hit in Washington, D.C., how many people were injured, how many were killed, the actual timeline of events. But that doesn't really give you an idea of what it was like to be in New York City that day. It doesn't make you appreciate what it's like to breathe in pulverized glass or something like that. To do that, to really put somebody there with a story such as that, you need the techniques of a fiction writer. You need to have the ability to do description in a vivid way with vivid details. You need to be able to portray people as the whole real characters that we actually are and have it unfold in a way that makes narrative sense to the reader, the viewer, the listener, or what have you. And it just really grabbed my attention. I had never had much experience with that form of narrative before, and once I completed that degree in composition and rhetoric, I went on to get an MFA in nonfiction writing because it really took hold of me. I didn't think it would, but it certainly did. The conspiracy end of things is a little more involved, and I tell you, we're going to have to go all the way back to when I was about a 5-year-old boy. And like many people my age, a transformative experience was seeing Star Wars, the very first one, with my dad. And I was ravenous after that for absolutely anything that was even remotely like Star Wars. And eventually, a couple years later in first grade, we would take trips to our local public library in small town Indiana. And as I'm going through the shelves, I pull off this book, and it has what look like spaceships on it. And I started flipping through, and I see these are actual photographs. And these are diagrams of aliens and saucer shapes, and I read the front and said UFOs. And I took it to my first grade teacher, and I said, "Is this real?" And she immediately got dismissive and said, "No, it's garbage. Do not waste your time with this at all. Put it back on the shelf." Well, naturally, what did I do? I found every book I could at that point, and I read it, and it was UFOs and the cover-ups supposedly about it engrossed me for quite a while. But then you get older and you get an education in science and other reasoning, and you find that there are reasonable explanations for – almost all of these things, and it, 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 after that, though, my questioning changed, where I was thinking more in terms of narrative in my academic background, thinking, how do these stories get started? Why do people, despite all evidence to the contrary, hold on to these crazy, well, maybe, and I don't mean to call them crazy. It's just maybe I can't see the evidence for them would be a better way to say that, but just sort of out there stories that, despite any evidence to the contrary, they still hold on to them. And so I really started looking at what that means. And I got involved with one particularly far out there claim involving a tiny town called Dulce, New Mexico, with a mesa there, Archuleta Mesa. And I'd read about it first in 1994, where there was this claim and that inside that mesa is an actual military facility jointly run by the United States and aliens. And people who are kidnapped, they end up there. They're experimented upon. And at one point, the deal went sour, and our special ops teams went in to take the mesa back. And it read like pulp science fiction. And that's what really engrossed me. And yet, despite it being pulpy, despite it sounding like something I would have seen in a, well, here in Chicago area, it'd be Svengoolie. See something like that. But there were people claiming it's the God's honest truth. And so I really I went out there, actually. I visited the town. It's on the Jicarilla Apache Reservation. And it's one of these things, and maybe we'll get into it later on, that these wild, outlandish conspiracy theories do start with small elements of truth. It's cases often where people add 2 and 2 and they come up with 6. And
sure. Okay. Well, interesting how this all came about for you. So, as you were talking about a minute ago about you mentioned literary fiction, it reminded me of something I'd read several years ago now, about this idea of taking an event with a fact that is very fact-based, sequential, and applying narrative to it. I read the story was about I forget what the jurisdiction was, but someplace where a court had an appointed narrative writer who, if you have a murder case, they lay out all the facts of the matter. Such and such happened, the forensic evidence is this, but they had someone assigned to write the story of that person. They would do the research about the person accused, and not to, provide matters of defense or mitigation, but simply to provide, you mentioned it, we're all people.
Right.
We are all characters with depth and this person's job. So as we were talking about the 9/11, what is it like to breathe pulverized glass?
Sure.
What is it like to have grown up in a certain environment that may have led to something? So it's fascinating stuff. So based on a true story, what does that mean to you?
Well, it means a few things. When I see that, I immediately think there's a few things that are going to be going on. If it's a book, then I'm going to go in with this sort of implicit contract with the writer, knowing that he or she has enhanced things in order to make it come alive for me as the reader. I'll give you an example. If I'm in a work I'm doing right now, an actual professor that I once knew, a former colleague, to make him come alive as a person and really portray him on the page, I know he's a runner. He's a jogger. And so I have this descriptive paragraph of him jogging. And it is on a spring day. It's going past Lake Benet in Rensselaer, Indiana. The ducks are moving in this sort of V formation, and the wind brings back his hair. He can smell the pine. And when my wife read that, he said, "Wow, he told you all that?" And I said, "No, honestly, no." I know that's his jogging route, but that particular moment, that it happened exactly that way, maybe not. But I have to take what I know and present it to the reader so they can be there with me on the page. We get invested in this story and know a little bit about that person, this particular colleague that I'm writing about. And one of his avocations, jogging, and kind of portraying him enjoying the landscape and on the property of the college, that helps make that come alive and understand a little bit more for the reader. Other things that may go on in a nonfiction story would be the compression of time. For example, back to something I'm working on, there's I take a look at the whole month of March. I have to shrink that down a little bit for a number of reasons. One, the interest of the reader. I don't think that the reader would especially appreciate a day-by-day, blow-by-blow, although it would be accurate if I could do that, but it would be tedious. So we want to take a look and filter out at what's going to be especially pertinent for this story. What are the things the reader must know? What are the particularly interesting or dramatic things? And so a month conceivably could come out to be 2 pages, depending upon the work, depending upon the subject. An example of that was popular was a book called Reading Lolita in Tehran by Azar Nafisi. And that is about a book club that met in Iran, and they met over 2 years. Well, naturally, the book can't cover all 2 years.
Can't get all that.
So this author is going to look at who the people were and moments in those book clubs that really told the reader interesting insights into their thought process, the conflicts maybe. And so it's not going to be blow by blow, but you're going to see that there are things that are compressed. And other times when there's somebody involved in a big situation, we mentioned 9/11, for example, or something that's particularly dramatic. There are multiple points of view. So you're getting things from this writer's point of view. And even if he or she is going out to interview other people, even if they are doing their best good faith effort as possible, the fact that they are writing it in a way alters the point of view.
Yeah.
So another example would be in what's very popular is the memoir genre. And in almost any event, and I ask anybody who's in law enforcement, you ask 5 people who were involved in a traffic accident or something like that, you're probably going to get 5 different stories.
Yeah.
One popular example I can give you from the memoir genre is the book The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. It's about growing up in a family that was at or below the poverty line, oftentimes an alcoholic father, and yet she portrays them as admirable people in several ways. But her brothers and sisters, when they read the book, would sometimes say, "I don't remember that happening," or "I remember that happening completely differently."
Yeah.
So that's human nature.
Yeah.
Point of view. If you read a book that says based on a true story and somebody else comes out later on and says, I don't remember that happening and I was there, don't be surprised.
Yeah.
That's just human nature.
Yeah, I'm reminded of something a story I heard in college about, picture you're 18, 19, 20 years old and you go on a date with the person you've wanted to go on a date with for a long time. Later on that day, your mother asks you how it went. The day after that, your best friend tells you how it went. That weekend, you're seeing your grandmother, and they ask you how it went.
Right.
The story is probably different than your pastor asks you about it, or a minister, or your neighbor. The story, the facts are the same.
Sure.
But the retelling of the story is different.
Absolutely.
Based on the audience.
Exactly.
And other circumstances.
Well, audience does influence writing so very, very much. So, and part of that, let's just be honest, if you're going through a publisher, or even if you're not, if you're independently published, you want to get a little back for so you want to sell books.
Sure, you got to sell books.
Yeah, right.
Yep. You were talking about the compressed timeline, and something else came to mind. It seems like we probably see a lot of this, not just in print works, but movies as well. It came to mind the movie Saving Private Ryan. There was a whole lot that went into that. I had to get it in 3 hours. That was a months long adventure, and there's those examples are all over the place, in the media and print things. So, you mentioned the project you're working on, where you're writing something about a colleague, and that person's a runner. But some of the other details, the running route, and so you fill in about details about weather and ducks and whatever else. This idea of kind of using research, or maybe research or just license to kind of fill gaps, and how is that a thing? Is that a common thing?
Very much. very much, especially if you're on the journalist side of literary journalism. The writer will often spend a very, very long time just getting immersed in their subject and getting things down in as many details as possible, because one of the techniques you'll find in the written form is what's called a digression. Example I had, well, there's a couple. We were just before the podcast here, we were talking about Devil in the White City. Big runaway hit. And what Erik Larson would do is when a subject would come up, something about, say, cultural norms at the time in Chicago, the 19th century, he would actually flag the reader. I remember saying, this may get long, but you're going to have to know it. You're going to have to. And that gives him the ability to pivot and go into the research that he has, and then guide the reader back into the sort of the main line of the narrative. But that digression gives you more information, and it makes the experience fuller. It makes you have a greater understanding. Another example that I go back to a lot, I'm a big fan of this book, is Sebastian Junger's The Perfect Storm. And it's this, of course, massive hurricane that hit, and he was inspired to write it by looking at basically a paragraph story in the New York Times about fishermen who were lost at sea. But he's looking at this event from all these multiple angles, and one of them is Coast Guard. And rescuing people at sea. And he will digress in the rescue scene to describe what standard operation is for the Coast Guard. He'll talk about the neoprene jumpsuits. He'll get into these details that shows he's actually spent a good deal of time with the Coast Guard in the long making of this book. So there are these digressions, and that's where the writer gets to show off his or her research. And I think that also is one of the areas you can look at for when you see based on a true story. They're giving a sense of authenticity to the reader. So I did my homework. Let me show you what I know.
Yeah, you and I were talking recently about another book that I read just recently, Into the Wild. And it was John Krakauer wrote that. He did not go into Alaska with the young man, and so he's piecing together what happened based on what we do know, and he's kind of connecting the dots and talking to people after the fact, and it's an interesting.
That happens a lot in literary nonfiction. With, as I just mentioned, The Perfect Storm, we have no real record of what happened on that boat, the Andrea Gale, other than a few radio transmissions. So what Junger ended up doing was talking to the family members, getting a sense of who these guys were, talking to fishermen, saying, what would you do in these situations? Exactly, and trying to piece together as best as possible what they probably went through.
Sure.
And another would be one of the more famous examples of the genre that kind of in its own way kicked it off was In Cold Blood, Truman Capote, where he describes the last hours of the Clutter family in Kansas. Nobody knows because the victims are dead in that book. So he has to, just based on interviews with people in the town who knew these people, what would they have probably been doing that night, and describing it as best as possible.
Okay, so we've been talking about this idea of something being based on a true story, and that seems to give some permission, some license for something to be based on truth, but not entirely precisely true, and all that that's part of our culture. So, given that, is there any wonder why? I'm moving now to conspiracy theories.
Sure.
Is there any wonder why conspiracies are a thing, and why people believe things that may or may not be true? I mean, talk to us about that a little bit.
I could do that, and in a little while, being an academic, I will cite sources, people that scholars that people can go out and
expect nothing less.
Okay, thank you. There are a few reasons. One is that life doesn't make any sense. Let's just face that there you can be the victim of random things, and it's tough to get your head around it. We like to have reasons. We like narrative. We like the story we want life to have a structure. We want life to have a story. And so when things just happen or they feel beyond your control, the idea of believing in a conspiracy in its odd sort of sense comforts us. That there was nothing we could have done, that the nebulous, shadowy they, are actually in control, and they have it out for the little guy, and so there wasn't anything you could have done to keep your job, let's say, if you experienced a massive layoff, or if somebody sadly gets cancer and dies. So, well, we're all at the mercy of that. There's really a cure for it, but the medical industry just makes so much money off of treating the symptoms. So that's one way. It gives a sense of control when there really isn't any control. It alleviates a sense of, in a way, blame for yourself and taking accountability that these, like I said, there's these forces that are out to get you. So, and also we as we talked about in the nonfiction section, that when big events are messy, 9/11, the JFK assassination, there are still aspects of those that naturally there aren't very good explanations for, but that's just the nature of such things, that they're not neat, they're not tidy. And anytime there is that sort of vacuum of information, that vacuum gets filled with all kinds of speculation and, well, conspiracy theory. A real life situation I went through that I'm writing about now, that I pointed to earlier, was the college that I worked at for so many years and went to for undergrad, and my father spent 50 years of his life teaching at it. It closed in May of 2017. So that was a big traumatic event for many people involved. Sure. And there was a vacuum of information in a lot of ways, and that naturally, the combination of the traumatic event and the lack of information gave rise to many, many conspiracy theories and so-called rabbit holes you could go down as to why this is happening. And later on, with a cooler head, as I did my research for the book I'm writing, I found many of those conspiracies certainly weren't true, but they made sense at the time. Sure. In a lot of ways, when you're trying to make sense out of a sudden traumatic event that doesn't make any sense. And another reason that there's a couple other reasons why conspiracy theories take on is because there are secrets. We were talking, your former Army, and things get kept secret for a reason, for national defense. And that automatically leads to speculation when things can't be talked about. And we have other occasions and instances and accidents in history where maybe our government wasn't always acting on the up and up. There was Watergate. There were all kinds of other little shadowy operations that either had to happen or happened as sort of without much oversight, maybe, that weren't the best decisions at the time. So once there are secrets, a logical question becomes, okay, what else aren't you telling me?
Right.
I have a student who keeps coming up with a different reason why he can't be in class. Eventually, I'm going to start saying, what's going on here? What aren't you telling me? Right. Let's get to the heart of the problem. Another reason for it is, frankly, the conspiracies are kind of fun. They combine the best aspects of X-Files and James Bond and all the other narratives, and we love a story. Yep. We love a good story, and what could be more exciting than a secret society that has all kinds of the trappings of those sorts of fictions, or in the case of UFOs, I mean, being visited from space. What could be more exciting than that?
What were the few years ago, several years ago, there was the Nicolas Cage movies, the National Treasure.
Sure.
Something. I mean, it's fun. It's
exactly.
It's a good time.
It's a good time. And we love a mystery.
Sure. You mentioned, we talked a couple times here about the kind of the big things in life, and it seems like the conspiracies can extend, or the idea of a conspiracy can extend beyond the actual event. I remember, 9/11 has been mentioned.
Sure.
But think about every plane crash that's happened since then. The default thought is when report of a plane crash, terrorists were involved. Well, more often than not, it's mechanical failure. And so everybody immediately calls in their, all the pundits call in their defense experts and everything else to, how could this have happened again? Well,
right.
It feels to me, and I'm certainly not an expert in this, there's something different about having something terrible happen that you can blame someone for rather than just an engine blowing up. Exactly. It just happens.
Exactly.
And so there's a psychological component to this that allows it doesn't really change the outcome, doesn't change what happened. It just feels like it's just easier to blame someone than something that just happened.
Very much, very much. Like I said, we want the world to be ordered. And I think that goes back to how much narrative is central to our life. You and I are engaging in narrative right now. You go into a job interview, you're telling them your narrative, your story. Exactly. And we want, with as much narrative as we consume and produce in our lives, we want real life to be that way. I heard a quote from Tom Clancy many years ago.
One of the greats.
Yeah, it's a great quote. He said that the difference between fiction and nonfiction is that fiction has to make sense.
Yeah.
You have to have it ordered. So when after all the fiction we consume, we expect our lives to have order. Well, coincidence happens all the time.
Sure.
We tend to think that coincidence can't happen to us in our regular lives or in the world writ large. So we try to look for patterns. And that's just, as I said, that's human tendency. We want to see something and make sense out of it.
And what you're describing here certainly isn't new. It's not,
No.
It's easy to, blame social media or, whatever else for spreading these things. But I mean, several years ago, I read Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Sure.
It was the explaining of things that couldn't be explained. How does this thing, the sun, move around? And so, it has to be some guy in a chariot who let his kid go flying around the sun. And so that these are things that we've always as humans just tried to grab hold of, something to explain.
You work with what you know.
Yeah.
And Ovid was.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, first century, it's what you had.
Right.
So what are some other, not examples of conspiracies, but there's got to be some. You mentioned military components in government and things. There's some things that are legit. We don't need to know about for good reasons.
Sure.
So how does that play into it? You mentioned the business of what else aren't you telling me?
Well, I guess one of the more recent ones would be, I want to say probably November 2017, when a story broke that the Navy, U.S. Navy, had been encountering UFOs. And there was gun camera footage from an F-18. And you can hear the pilots. They're screaming at each other, saying, "What is this thing? Look at it move." And it's moving faster and maneuvering more sharply than anything. It became known as the Tic Tac UFO because in the gun sight, that's what it looks like. It's a little black Tic Tac.
I've never heard about this.
Yes. And what made it significant was the Navy, not too long ago, actually confirmed it. Said, yes, this happened. We don't know what it is. We don't believe it to be a threat to national security. And they used the phrase unidentified aerial phenomenon. So what that may be is more than likely, before jumping to aliens or anything else, a new form of drone. Our government is relying more and more on drone technology, and more than a few UFO sightings were later on found to be prototypes for drones.
Interesting.
And so this could be a new form of drone that or another reason they may not want to talk about, a foreign power has. Yeah. And it could also be, if there is any kind of conspiracy in regard to, as they call it now, unidentified aerial phenomenon, it would be the only likely one I could see is that they just plain don't know. And you don't want to admit, of course, if you're charged with national security, that we don't know what this is.
You don't have the answer.
Yeah,
right.
That may be more detrimental to getting out than an actual secret in many cases. So that would be a more recent example. Another bit more frightening example would be the Pizzagate conspiracy that somehow got started in the more shadowy corners of the internet, that Democratic leaders were involved in a child slavery ring, and it was being run out of a couple different pizza places. One in particular, how this place, I don't know right offhand, it's called Comet. Comet Ping Pong, referred to in the area of Washington, D.C. just as Comet. It's a regular pizza place, and on December 4th of 2016, a man named Edgar Welch from North Carolina showed up carrying an AR-15, saying that he was there to free the kids that were being kept there in slavery. Of course, there weren't any.
There were no kids. There was no slavery.
Right. The man was arrested, and in his deposition to police, he said, "I really wanted to help the kids, and I thought I could be a hero." 28-year-old man thinking this. And I thought, after I saw that, I thought, well, here is somebody whose heart is absolutely in the right place. He wants to help people and stop what would be an atrocity. However, his critical reasoning is not in the right place. That how could this happen to begin with? So, but if all you're consuming is something from these message boards or social media websites that, I'm not talking about the mainstream things like Facebook and Twitter or that sort of things, but to believe that is true and to bring yourself to take up arms and go into a place, somebody could have seriously gotten hurt, and thank goodness no one was.
Sure.
Now, the pizza place to this day still has issues. They were subject to an arson attack back in January of this year. So that's where I see conspiracy being a legitimate issue, where it could lead to somebody getting hurt. Also, when it leads to the rejection of our fact-based institutions that we rely on, such as good journalism, academics, and our military intelligence officers, when those are being disregarded, then our whole society has an issue.
Sure. So I was going to ask you about, so we were talking a few minutes ago about some of these things are fun, the national treasure, the fun, and, the
Da Vinci
adventure,
Code.
Da Vinci Code, exactly,
Right.
all these things. But there seems to be some real danger in some of this. So you've mentioned a couple of them, but what those are kind of the big scale kind of things, the things you would hear about in the news. Someone walking into a pizza place with an AR-15, but it seems like, and I could be wrong, but it seems like there could be, danger just at the more local level. I mean, what is the impact? Is there an impact of blind, maybe irrational adherence to something just within smaller social circles that may not even appear in the news?
I think that it just goes back to what I was saying. It's the erosion of our ability to be critical consumers of information. And while, yes, it's good to be skeptical of what you see in the news, it's good to be skeptical of what you get in a press release or something else that you see. You can take it too far. And too far means when you are discounting expertise.
Sure.
When there are people who really are quality investigative journalists, who are scientists who devoted their whole lives to studying things.
Sure.
And again, if we are to be supportive of our military, then certainly the officer corps, and they're among the best educated in our country in a lot of ways, and the intelligence gathering apparatus of the various services and the CIA. They're people we entrust.
Sure.
To keep us safe. So it's when we begin to discount that and reject that we might be willing to listen to other voices that aren't either as well-reasoned or they don't have good motives.
Sure.
They want to lead you astray because they know that they can.
Sure.
And I think that affects our public discourse.
Yeah.
That affects how people vote. That affects how things are conducted in our schools. And I think if we're looking at things at a local level, that's really the danger. One example I mentioned to you, and while this isn't a danger per se, is something that really interests me is of these alien conspiracies. I had somebody tell me that our current president is the first president in many decades who is not actually a reptile alien in disguise.
Nice.
And
Well,
he is actually an actual human who is out to save us from the alien agenda, because the alien agenda is working with the deep state. Now, when I've just described this to you, your brain cannot help but form a picture, paint a picture of the person I talked about. And I tell this to my students. I say, what do you see when I describe that? One person said, it's a goth girl with a lot of rings in her ear, one through her nose. Another guy said, I see a total burnout dude. He's got flannel. He's been smoking marijuana all day long. And I said, no. This is a 30-something woman who is a mortgage broker. She drives a Mercedes. If you walk past her on the street, you wouldn't bat an eye. She looks as normal and suburban as anybody could be, but believes this wholeheartedly.
Interesting.
So I had to ask, as I keep doing with these conspiracy narratives, what brings somebody who is otherwise quite reasonable to find this as fact? When I conducted my research for the book I will eventually go back to on the Dulce incident that I mentioned when I traveled to New Mexico, it was always unsettling to me when I would interview somebody. We would start off with sort of like just like we're doing. Who are you? Tell me about your background. Oh, I went to school here, got a job at this business, came to the area 20 years ago. Okay, now tell me about the incident you had. Well, first time I saw a dead alien was, and they would segue into it as if we were talking about the weather.
Yep. Okay.
And it is one of those situations where I don't doubt that they believe in what they're saying,
Sure.
but what prompted them to have that thought or that belief, I just don't see the evidence for. So I turn to wondering, how did this person come to that point? So again, just bringing it back to your question, I think the local level danger is critical reasoning. And if we look at all news as fake news, and doubtless, I agree, there are fake stories out there. There are obviously sites that pass themselves off as being news sites that really aren't, or the quality of their journalism isn't all that good. But when we discount everything,
Sure.
and we are critical to the point of none of it's true, then we have an issue. Or you're always sort of doing this sort of mental gymnastics of, one thing a conspiracy theorist will fall back on is, well, that's just what they want you to think.
Sure.
If you do that for everything, you could do that
Sure.
for like every explanation. Say, well, that's just what they want you to think. Well, where does that stop and where does truth lie?
Yeah, as you were talking, you would talk about the military a lot and journalism and all these kind of respected institutions, and we don't hear about it so much anymore. But there was this period of time a couple of years ago where the police are getting maligned, local
Yes.
police departments getting maligned. In part, and you mentioned it earlier on at the beginning, there's usually a seed of truth to
Yes.
much of this. There's no doubt there are bad police officers and even, maybe widespread bad police departments or police departments with a problem. But when the society cannot trust the police,
That's a great example.
that's a problem.
Yes.
That is a problem, because that is something. You mentioned voting. That affects local voting, and then local voting affects other things. And so it's this idea that the police are out to be wrong, whatever it is, however it is presented. Though that does exist, and that's the source of the problem. It does exist. But how do you make it to where it's not seen as widespread and
Yes.
universal? So,
Yes.
Anyway, I certainly don't have any solution. I'm not offering anything, but just for your take.
I think that that's an excellent example. And having worked with a few police officers just as a volunteer basis, that is something they would talk about. Say they're trying to conduct an investigation, they're trying to apprehend someone, and no one's talking. That's always been a problem, but now it's even more so. You're police, I'm not going to have anything to do with you. And you're absolutely right. This does stem from some terrible incidents that happened where unarmed people were murdered, or incidents that just probably could have been obviously handled a little bit better. And again, though, that's true for any discipline of work that you look at, but that affects our critical reasoning skills if we're just going to discount entire people that we rely upon.
So John, we've talked a lot about a lot of different things here. The fact that most everybody has some sort of cell phone, a way to document something either by audio or video or something. And so then they can post it and they can edit. They're self-edited. Everybody edits whatever they want. So they can show the bad or the good of whatever it is. But
Absolutely.
how does the fact, not the idea, but the fact that anybody can tell most any story they want to,
Right.
to a very large audience, thanks to Twitter and Facebook and the virility of posts. So how does that play into all this?
It means we have to have a whole new kind of literacy. My background is in rhetoric, which initially started the good old-fashioned way of looking at a text and taking it apart, figuring out.
And by text, you mean a piece of something written on paper.
Exactly, written on paper,
not an SMS.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. I am taking it apart. I'm trying to figure out who this writer is, what audience he or she intended, what is the main point, and just all sorts of things. What kind of arguments is this person making? Because everybody's making an argument. We need to do the same thing with visuals. And that's what I'm trying to do with my students. We need to learn how to read. There's this saying, well, the picture speaks for itself. No, it really doesn't.
Actually, no.
You have to know how to read pictures now. And we've seen that so many times. Just last January, I believe it was, or it was over the break possibly, the Nicholas Sandmann case, where it appeared that there was this young high school boy mocking a Native American man. And it is, when you unpack the situation, it is a situation where nobody really looks good. But the one picture that went everywhere where it looked like this boy was in the man's face was just one sliver of the reality. When you look at all the other ones, there is a mob of media surrounding these two. They were not squaring off one-on-one, and it's learning to look at a photo and say, what else is going on? I think that's where we start with the other question. What else is going on leading up to this more than what I'm seeing? What is the deep story? Sort of hearkening it to what a nonfiction writer would do. We were talking about earlier that someone can look at, like Sebastian Junger, that there were a few fishermen lost to sea. What's the deep story here? What are all the different angles? And so they'll go off and they do this research. Well, it'd be great if we could all have the time to do that and didn't have dentist appointments to make, jobs to get to, dinner to make, that sort of thing. But it's just, at the very least, having this sort of literacy and looking at how is this shot framed, where is it from, and what else is going on, because there's always something else going on in the shot. As far as social media, well, the obvious no-brainer there is it makes it easier and faster to share things. And the sort of crazy, or I'll just call it out there stories, as I talked about with Dulce and the supposed alien base, which I learned about the story of it anyway in like 1994. That was just from a buddy who was into crazy stuff, and those were in the very early self-published books. Looks like somebody did it on a copier. Now you can post anything, any blog, and so it's a much quicker proliferation and a reduction in the stop and think time. We are at a point where people see a headline and they'll share the article. I think that's part of it. Without stopping to really reason through how likely this is. And I think there's a lot of questions to ask yourself. One that comes from an academic named Joseph Osinski, who wrote a whole book on conspiracies, is available on Amazon. He's a political science professor, and he has a great analogy for these long-term conspiracies, such as keeping cures for cancer secret, or we faked the moon landing or something like that. He said, consider the amount of people involved, and he said, think about this. Think about your favorite rock band. Got them in mind? Good. Okay. Are they still around, at least in their original lineup? And unless you're talking about a rarity like a band like U2 that's been around for 30 more years, it's still the same four guys, likely it isn't, because people, after a time, don't work together very well. There are disagreements, there are falling outs, or just seeing things differently, and so people part ways. The same thing would logically happen with conspiracies, and somebody would eventually talk. Somebody would not get along anymore, and we'd have somebody who would turn a witness and ask for protection. Another academic named David Grimes, he's a physicist at Oxford University, and he developed an actual equation to calculate how long it would take before, given the sheer amount of people involved in keeping something secret, how many years it would take before something got out. So as I mentioned, the moon hoax, moon landing hoax idea, he calculated the truth would have been known in 3.7 years. The secret cure for cancer, he calculated 3.2 years we would have known, just
due to the number of people on Earth and the people's limited ability to keep things quiet. I mean, we, in preparation for this podcast, you had mentioned as a communications manager for organizations that a story gets out. Information has this tendency to want to be free, and people a lot of times are terrible secret keepers. Sure. So those are things to keep in mind when confronting something in social media of how likely is this, how many people would it take to pull this off, and how realistic is it they could all keep quiet. So it seems like, the ability, the big microphone, the big megaphone we all have with social media, the ability to share things widely is powerful, and that causes things to spread. But it seems like it also reduces the amount of time for it to be debunked, because there are enough people now looking at it, whatever it is, and to say, no, fake, or
And is just as we said earlier, we love stories. I mean, good ones, exciting ones. And what could be more exciting than a few of these that we mentioned? And so someone, and especially someone who may feel, for a lot of good reasons, rather powerless in their life, and it gives them something, and it gives them a reason to, okay, that's why I'm in this situation. And if it's especially entertaining, it becomes I've seen it become something of an obsession for people. That it's like going to the movies or reading fun fiction.
Yeah. We started talking about the idea of what based on a true story is.
Yes.
And conspiracies, and I don't know if there's any direct linkage, but to maybe put a point on this, what should people know and think about in connecting these two or separating these two ideas?
Well, I think that one thing to keep in mind, we mentioned that when a writer writes, it's from his or her point of view. That is inevitable. And even when they're trying to combine multiple points of view, we hear the part of conspiracy is this idea of fake news. And yes, there are websites out there that are not legitimate. They're not telling true things. But when we're looking at major news, it's not so much that it's fake, that it's false. It's from a point of view. And this is something I do with my students. They have to write a report, and the genre of a report must be completely fact-based. Don't put any of your opinion in. And I assigned them recently the impeachment process. And I said, report only facts. And
good luck with that.
Well, that's just it. You have to pick a focus because a report, whole books are going to be written about this when it's all said and done. But for a 3-page report, you've got to narrow your focus. So one of the choices for your focus could be, okay, what are the allegations? What are certain political forces saying? How another focus could be, how is the president defending himself?
Sure.
What is that response? So depending upon the focus that you take, depends on the information you present. That's exactly what we're seeing in news. Mm-hmm. That point of view and determining what focus to filter all this through, it isn't fake so much. The information, more often than not, sure, there are always times that journalism gets it wrong and they have to cop to that, hopefully, but the lens through which we're getting it, that's what's going to alter what we get. And it depends upon your news source. So keeping that in mind is always good. Keeping in mind the business aspect of news, that they've got to sell ad time. And just also, I think it's good to engage with multiple news sources.
Sure.
If you're getting it all from CNN or getting all from Fox, you're not getting all the stories. So try to engage with different ones.
Sure.
And keep critical thinking in mind, but not to the point where we're absolutely rejecting everything. And I think your example of police departments was spot on, that I understand why there are populations that may think fear first upon seeing a police officer, but if we all start thinking that way and we can't trust people that we fund to protect ourselves, then there's an issue in society.
Yeah.
Then it's a problem.
Probably true. We all need to work together to get through those issues. So what is your takeaway to students about this topic? What would you tell, if you could tell all students everywhere, and so you were just talking about the thing about critical thinking and whatever. So summarize in a sentence or two, kind of the takeaway from this whole discussion. We started off talking, because we didn't intentionally did not want this to be about Waubonsie.
Right.
You're a faculty member at Waubonsie. I work at Waubonsie. This happens to be a Waubonsie thing. But maybe we started off, you've been at Waubonsie for 2 years and whatever. Now, okay, you're a faculty member. What would you like? What would be your lesson, your parting shot to students?
I'm glad you asked that, because it would be my parting message to not just students, but anybody in our community listening. And that would be, don't believe, don't disbelieve, think.
There you go.
Take each claim, consider it, and consider what kind of evidence is available to support whatever claim that someone is making.
We spent the last little bit with John Nichols, instructor of English at Waubonsie Community College, and it's been a delight. I have learned much.
Well, thank you.
I'm glad we have folks like you who help us think through these things, and look forward to doing this again.
I thank you for having me, and I would love to be back again.